JWildfire can render 3D flames as solids, with custom lighting and materials to show off their three-dimensional form. In this video, we'll look at how to control the lights, including their direction, intensity, and color. Materials, which control how lights interact with the surfaces, and shadows are also important for solid rendering, but we won't cover them in detail here. We'll be using JWildfire version 5.50, which is the latest version as this video is being recorded. It only has one kind of light, called, in the 3D graphics world, Directional Light. Although JWildfire doesn't use that term, it just calls it light since it's the only light there is. Directional light doesn't have a specific source, but it does travel in a particular direction. And it hits every point of every surface with the same direction and the same intensity, irregardless of any other points or objects, which means it doesn't inherently cast shadows. Now, shadow calculation is something that JWildfire can do by tracing a path from each point back towards the direction of the light to see if other objects are in the way. But that's a different function, and we won't be covering that in this video. Even though directional light doesn't have a particular source, it's helpful to think of it as coming from a particular source that's very far away, like the sun. Indeed, directional light is used in many 3D graphics programs to model sunlight and moonlight since they have similar characteristics. It's just more intuitive to think of the light as coming from somewhere than in going in a particular direction. But remember that other objects don't get in the way. It doesn't cast shadows like sunlight would do. Shadow calculation is a separate function in JWildfire. Now, the direction of the light is important because it shows how bright each point in the surface will be. A point that's facing towards the light will be bright. A point that's facing slightly away from the light will be slightly dimmer. A point that's facing completely away from the light won't be illuminated by the light at all. It'll be dark. It's this gradation of lighting that gives solid objects their three-dimensional appearance. To see how this works, let's compare how a sphere and a cube are affected by directional light. The background is dark gray so we can see the black unlit sides of the objects. They are lit with a single light that we can imagine is up and to the left and slightly towards the camera, casting light whose direction is the opposite, down and to the right and slightly away from the camera. The brightest spot on the sphere is the point facing the light. From there, the points face gradually away from the light so they get dimmer and dimmer. Points facing the opposite direction of the light aren't affected by it. It's important to understand here that these points are not black because the points are in the shadow of the other side of the sphere. They receive the same intensity of the light as the other points, but since they are facing the wrong direction, they ignore it. The cube is a bit different, but the same principles apply. All the points on a given face of the cube face the same direction, so they're shaded the same. On the top face, the points face somewhat towards the light, but not directly towards it, so have a light shade. The points on the left face are facing further away from the light, but still somewhat towards it, so they get a darker shade. The points on the right face don't face the light at all, so they're black. Again, this is because of the direction they're facing, not because of any shadow effect. With this background, let's go to JWildfire and see how to control the lights. It's easier to see how the controls work with the sphere, so that's what's loaded here. It's made using the PowerPlot 2D WF variation with preset 39. Solid render mode is enabled, as we can see this button here is pressed. And the camera settings are at the default. There's no rotations, which means that the x-axis is horizontal, the y-axis is vertical, and the z-axis is facing the camera. The material is set to use only diffuse light, which is the light that we'll be playing with. JWildfire supports multiple lights, and normally we want more than one, but we'll start with a single light to keep it simple. The most important setting, of course, is the direction of the light. It is set using the altitude and azimuth controls here in the light settings. Using altitude and azimuth is a standard way to specify direction, although JWildfire use is a bit unconventional. But notice the asterisk next to the altitude and azimuth. That means that the changes to them will show in the preview without re-rendering. But the preview does need to be rendered first. So let's click the preview render button and let that render. We can see the progress in the indicator up here, but as soon as it gets to the 100%, that's the flame rendering. It takes a bit longer after it reaches the 100% to actually render the solid. Let's start by setting both the altitude and the azimuth to 0. This puts the light on the negative z-axis, pointing toward positive z, toward the camera. With no rotation, that means it's pointing towards the camera, illuminating the back of the sphere, so the side that we see is black. Now if we change altitude to 90 degrees, we can see that the light moves up, which is logical for a control named altitude. It's now pointing straight down, so the top half of the sphere is lit. Now we see the light. Let's use the altitude slider to increase it further. As we increase the altitude slider, the light moves down even further until we get to 180 degrees when it's facing directly towards the camera and the whole thing is lit. As we keep going, we can either continue past 180 degrees, and when it reaches 270 degrees, it's at the very bottom. Or 180 is again toward the camera, minus 180 degrees is the same, and we can go negative, we can go then towards 0, again increasing it, and it goes down until negative 90 degrees is straight down. It doesn't really matter which one we use. 270 degrees and minus 90 degrees are the same angle. It's just a matter of convenience. Either one works just fine. Let's set the altitude back to 180 and change the azimuth. As we increase azimuth, the light moves towards the right. And when it hit 90 degrees, it's directly to the right side. The opposite happens when we decrease it. Until we hit minus 90 degrees, it's at the exact left. This is really the tricky part. When the azimuth is 90 or minus 90 degrees, so here's minus 90, the light is always directed to the side. Changing the altitude doesn't have any effect at all. Because of this, I like to set the altitude first, at least roughly, with the azimuth set to 0. And then change the azimuth to get the light where I want it. Then I fine-tune both. Setting the azimuth first runs the risk that it gets close to 90, and then altitude won't really do very much. So far, so easy. With the rotations all at 0, the altitude and azimuth controls for the lights are pretty easy to predict. But the lights move along, they rotate along with the flame. So if you rotate the flame, the lights rotate along with it. Sometimes this is just what you want. Sometimes small adjustments to the lighting are needed. But if you make large changes to the rotation, you usually have to start over again with the lighting. For those reasons, I recommend that you get your rotations set at least pretty close before you start making too many fine adjustments with the lighting. With the flame rotated, it's a bit trickier to make the light adjustment just how you want them to, because you don't know which way is up. It can be basically in any direction at all. What I like to do is move the lights around a little bit, just back and forth, to sort of see which direction is which. And when you rotate a sphere, it doesn't really do anything. The sphere is the same no matter how you rotate it. So let's pick a different shape to show how this works. We'll use a trianguloid trefoil. To get this shape, we use again the Parplot 2D WF formula with preset 26. To get this orientation, we had the pitch, yaw, and bank settings to something besides 0 to make it look at this particular orientation. Let's switch to the light settings and see how they work here. I like to start by setting both of them to 0. Now if that leaves the flame mostly blank, as it does here, I change the altitude to 180 to put the light on the other side of the flame. That's a little better. Now what we do is just move the altitude slider back and forth to see how it affects the light direction. Here, if we increase altitude, it moves the light to the left, and if we decrease altitude, it moves it to the right. Now we set it back to about 180. Doesn't have to be perfect. And we move the azimuth. The azimuth is generally perpendicular to altitude, so as expected, it moves the light up and down. Increasing moves it down, decreasing moves it up. So, what we do, since we want to set altitude first, we set the azimuth back to 0 and find a nice value for the altitude. I'm thinking maybe about 200. Looks good. Then we set azimuth. Azimuth, decrease it. Yeah, that looks pretty good there. But now we go back and forth to find a nice position. It's hard to get it exactly right just with one, the first time. So maybe decrease the altitude a little bit. Yeah, 145, something like that, 146. And increase the azimuth a little bit. And just keep going back and forth until either any change makes it worse or I get tired, whichever comes first. So that looks pretty good there. Now with a single light, there will always be some black spots that face away from the light. We need a second light to illuminate them. It's easy to add one. Just click the Add button next to the light selection drop down here. The idea is to add some fill light, not to overpower the flame with bright light. So the first thing I do is reduce the light intensity. Let's make it say 0.5. But it's still hard to see the new light with the first light shining so brightly. So let's go back to the first light and turn it off by changing the intensity to 0. Now, when we do this, we need to go re-render the preview so that you can see it, because it looks rather awful right now. But I'm going to change back to light 0 first, sorry, to light 1. That's one I'm going to be adjusting. So this is just light 1. Light 0 is now off. And we adjust the second light the same way we did the first. The altitude and azimuth now apply to light 1. So just before, we set it to, let's go to 180, because I know that was what we need for this one, but to 0 if that's the better one. And the azimuth to 0 as well. And that's actually pretty close to where we want it. The areas that were black with just light 0 have some light now, but we can tweak it a little bit. Maybe go up to 192, something like that. And increase the azimuth a little bit, maybe just a hair. 13 looks pretty good. Now we go back to the first light and set the intensity back to 1. And we render it here. Notice the dark areas now are filled in a bit, though it's a bit bright where the lights overlap. So let's reduce the intensity of this light to 0.9, and that I think looks a little bit better. Now sometimes more lights are needed to fill in areas that aren't covered. In this particular example here, there are a couple of areas here which are a little bit dark, but they're mostly filled in. And in this particular case, I actually like these dark areas because they help define the 3D shape. So I'm not going to add another light, but it's easy to do. Just click the Add button and add another light, and do that over and over again as many times as you need lights. The other settings here are straightforward. We've already discussed light intensity. It makes the selected light brighter or dimmer. As already mentioned, shadow calculation is a separate function, not something the lights do themselves. The Cast Shadows checkbox will only work if hard shadows are enabled, and it specifies which lights will be used in the shadow calculation. If shadows are enabled and the Cast Shadows is checked, then the shadow intensity will control how dark the shadows will be from the selected light. But shadows are another topic that we're not going to cover here. There is one more setting here, light color, which is just what it sounds like. It lets us use colored lights. If we click the button with the die, it sets it to a random color. Or we can click this color swatch. Let's just try that. We can click the color swatch to set the color ourselves. Now changing the color on the main light just results in a mostly monochrome image, which is just fine if that's what you want and it suits your artistic intent. I personally prefer to keep the main light white. And then to add color, we can add additional color lights. This produces a more subtle effect. So let's add another light by clicking Add. This is light 2. We'll change its color by clicking the color swatch and picking a nice color here, like that one, saying OK. And now we have a colored light. Of course, we want to position that light so that it's in a nice spot. and I'm just going to do it real rough here. Again, you'd spend a lot of time and go back and forth, and this video is already getting kind of long, so I'm just going to sort of give it somewhere close. Then let's add one more light, light 3 this time. It's the 4th light. Set its color to something interesting. Maybe this color right here. And I want to try to illuminate sort of these areas under here that are in the shadow. So let's increase the altitude a little bit. And make the azimuth go the other way. Maybe the altitude goes a little bit more. There we go. And that looks pretty nice. Let's sort of stop there, but you can sort of see the possibilities of using different colors of lights. Well, that's the basics of the light settings for JWildfire solid renders. Thanks for watching. The best way to learn this is to actually do it yourself. Try some of the settings on your own flames as you move the lights around and see how they work. You'll get more of an intuition and a feel for what looks best and how to make them work in your own flames.